continuing our journey through the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon is going through a series of experiments to see what would life be like if there was nothing but what is under the sun, just the horizontal world in which we live. And in this next experiment of life under the sun, he ponders the passage of time and all of the events that take place in it, to see if any sense of purpose can be found in them, and to see if there's any influence that we can have in what happens in life. Now that poem, verses 1 to 8, it's not Solomon just thinking of things off the top of his head as he goes. It's a very carefully crafted poem. It contains the trademark Hebrew parallelism, and it has a rhythm, not just in the way it sounds as it's read out, but also in the way that it swings back and forth between positive and negative. So the poem rhymes not in the sound of the words, but in the emotional impact that those words have on the reader. Remember chapter 1, we saw that image of life going round and round without any sense of meaning or goal. Well, this image is of things swinging back and forth, also without any apparent purpose. If you go to a playground, you'll see the roundabouts that just go round and round and round. Well, this is more like the swing that just blows in the wind, back and forth, without any sense of meaning. See how it's made up of 7 pairs of contrasts, in which the second of each pair complements or completes the first. So a time to be born and a time to die matches a time to plant and a time to pluck up what's planted, and so on. Now, Solomon tells us right at the start in verse 1 what the point of this poem is, and he does it again in a chiasm. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter, and all of it is under heaven. There's a couple of words here that we need to dig into. The word for season means an appointed time, something that's already decided or determined, something that we can predict, like seasons. We can say winter is coming and it's going to happen because it happens with regularity. Or it's a bit like an appointment that I put in my diary to meet with someone for coffee in the coming week, with a set time and a set place. Then the word for time refers to what happens as life unfolds, in the way that events happen without being planned. So a bit like me just bumping into someone I know on the street and find we're both free, so we sit down for a coffee. It hasn't been scheduled, but it's just happened. So seasons, that word implies that I have some degree of control over my life because there's a predictable regularity to things, and I can determine to a degree what happens and what I do. But time, the word, implies that since I know nothing about the future and I know nothing about 99.9% of what's happening in the world around me, I can only take things a day or a moment at a time, and I just have to cope with whatever life dishes out to me. But while these two words have this difference in meaning, Solomon uses them here in a parallel way, as if they're synonymous. It's as if he's asking, do we really have any say over what happens in life? Can we really plan and shape the future? Or are things that we think have purpose just random or ultimately fatalistic, an unfolding of cause and effect? We want our life to be defined by seasons so that we can predict and plan and prepare for what's to come. But in actual fact, our life is more often defined by time, when our careful plans are overthrown by events beyond our control. I think that's what causes most of our anxiety, when we sense that we've lost a degree of control over our lives. So notice that after verse 1, he abandons that word season and he simply uses the word time, because in this experiment of life under the sun, it seems that time is the bleak reality that overturns any sense of hope or of seasons. Now, there's another word in this introduction that we need to understand a bit more. This word, matter. It actually means pleasure, in the sense of something that we lean towards. We do it because we want to, and because of that we find some degree of enjoyment in it, even if it's bad or negative, as half of these things are. And this highlights even more this dilemma, this tension between season and time, between us making our plans and things just happening outside our control. So the question is, can we really find enjoyment in what happens? Or is even our enjoyment, as we saw last week, like the madness of laughing at a mist? Well, let's look briefly at each of these pairs and see how this dilemma is intensified by how they're put together. So first, birth and death, and planting and plucking. So this image parallels the natural course of a human life, birth and death, with the task of a farmer, planting and harvesting. Birth is like planting, death is like being plucked up. So the question is, are our lives more significant than a plant that lasts a few months and then is gone? Well, a life under the sun view would say, not really. Killing and healing, and breaking down and building up. Now, this image parallels a human life that is intervened in by human action, and it's compared with a walled city that's built and secured by its inhabitants, only to then have the enemy come and demolish it. Most ancient city ruins that have been uncovered by archaeologists have multiple layers, showing this pattern of destruction and rebuilding over many generations. So are our lives as tenuous and as vulnerable as an ancient city? Or a life under the sun view seems to say, yes, it is. Next, weeping and laughing, mourning and dancing. Now see how the first pair is vocal expressions of grief or joy, and the second pair are whole body expressions. For Jews, mourning involved pulling hair and beating chests. Now the irony of these expressions is that if viewed from a distance without the sounds, we can't be sure if a person is weeping or laughing. Are they mourning or are they dancing? So the question is, well, what's the difference between these emotions, opposite emotions of grief and joy? And a life under the sun view says, in the end, no difference. Next, casting away stones and gathering stones, embracing and refraining from embracing. Now, stones had many uses in the Old Testament world. One of them was the execution of someone convicted of a capital crime, a serious crime. So, casting away stones means that the death sentence has been overturned. Gathering them means it's about to be carried out. So put then in parallel with embracing the most intimate, trusting expression of human affection, makes us ask, is withholding affection from someone equivalent to putting them to death? Where a life under the sun view says yes. Next, seeking and losing, keeping and casting away. Now this is more about people than about objects. There are two ways in which someone could become estranged from me: when they wander away themselves and I don't go and find them, or when I choose not to keep or protect them and instead I cast them out. So does it matter in the end who is responsible for human alienation, the one who left or the one who cast out? And a life under the sun view seems to say not really. Next, tearing and sewing, keeping silence and speaking. Now in biblical times, cloth was valuable because of the work that it took to produce it and because it kept you warm, it covered your nakedness. Torn clothes wouldn't be thrown out like we just do today. They would be repaired. But tearing clothes was a way to express extreme grief or outrage. Now the parallel there with human silence and speaking shows the damage that's caused when we are silent in the face of injustice. It tears, versus the good that we can do by speaking up on behalf of someone, sewing and repairing. But the question, can human life be compared just to an item of clothing that's destroyed or saved? A life under the sun view seems to say, yes, it can. And then finally, love and hate, war and peace. This speaks of human conflict on the small and the large scales, the interpersonal level and then the national or tribal level. In love and hate, we take personal moral responsibility for our actions. But most often in war and peace, we're just caught up in the big machine of politics and the outworking of generational hostility. What they have in common is that both personal hatred and war have been going on for time immemorial. And every attempt that human beings have made to make love and peace reign, they've failed. So is there any hope that love will conquer hate, that peace will replace war? Well, a life under the sun view says not a chance. Solomon's conclusion to this poem then is very brief but to the point. What gain has the worker from his toil? The question with the implied answer, nothing. From a life under the sun perspective, I can't see my actions as having any real or significant effect on the course of events or the passage of time. Look again at that list of 28 actions in all and ask yourself, how many of these things do I really have control over? Even if I make plans for the positive things, I can never guarantee that they'll come to pass. Even if I work hard to avoid the negative things, will I ever be able to stop them from happening? Now, there are only two conclusions from this under the sun perspective that we can come to about why things happen as they do. First is to say, well, the events of time, they're just random, they're unordered. There's an infinite number of variables, and it offers no real security for the future because, well, one small action today might trigger a chain reaction that is entirely unpredictable. So in this view, human free will is incredibly dangerous. A decision I make today might ultimately lead to the extinction of the entire human race. Who knows? The other way we might look at it is that the events of time are locked into a fatalistic order. The past, the present, and the future is entirely predetermined, and no matter what we do, cannot be changed. So what appears to us to be random is just fixed. And in that scenario, what we call human free will is just an illusion, because we're just slaves to fate. Now, these two views of life is random or life is fatalistic, they've been pondered and debated by philosophers for millennia, right from the Greek philosophers who came centuries before Jesus up to the modern philosophers and even pop culture. If you're over 30, you may remember the blockbuster trilogy of movies, The Matrix. I'm a sci-fi fan, so as soon as they came out, I went to watch them. In these movies, human beings discover that they're living in a computer simulation built by artificial intelligence. A little bit of a prophetic movie in some ways. But what many people who watch these movies, or who chose not to watch because sci-fi is not their thing, what they didn't realise is that these movies were based on the writings, the musings of 20th century philosophers who wrote about the nature of reality, whether what we think is real, whether it is actually real, whether free will is a thing or whether it's just an illusion. Today you might occasionally hear the phrase, "take the red pill." That comes from the first Matrix movie, and it refers to making a choice to face the uncomfortable truth and to step out of the matrix, rather than taking the blue pill, which would send the person back into blissful ignorance, into the fake reality. Well, Ecclesiastes is, for us, in a sense, is taking the red pill. It forces us to look at the world around us and ask, are our conclusions about the way things are they actually right and true and satisfying? Is there another way to see life that doesn't leave us either in the insecurity of a chaotic universe with no certain future, or in the slavery of fatalistic predeterminism in which I have no real significance? Or as Solomon said, "What gain have I from my toil?" Well, as quickly as Solomon states this under the sun conclusion, he takes us then to see the vertical perspective, in which it's neither chance nor fate. It is a personal God who oversees time and events. So let's see the four things that he concludes, things that actually will enable us to know joy in the otherwise random or fateful passage of time. Firstly, joy in the beauty of God's purposes. Now he repeats here a phrase he used back in chapter 1, verse 13, the busyness that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Back in chapter 1, he described it as unhappy, because trying to discover meaning in life on the horizontal is like chasing the wind. But here he drops the word unhappy, because the vertical perspective shows us something different. God, who is working all things together for good. See the contrast between verse 11 and verse 1. In verse 1, everything just happens as time unfolds, whether randomly or fatalistically. But here in verse 11, everything happens as the unfolding of God's good purposes. Because And because of that, everything can be described as beautiful. God's purposes show us that rather than my life being defined merely by time, I can see that my life is defined instead by the beauty of God's purposes. Secondly, joy in not being in charge of my destiny. This phrase, eternity into men's hearts, means that among all the creatures, we are the only ones who are able to see and ponder and speculate about the future, as far as we know. I'm pretty sure my dog doesn't sit down and contemplate these things. She doesn't write poems about it or get anxious about it. We alone can conceive of things such as eternity. We can have knowledge of how this reality shapes our lives. Yet at the same time, we're told we can't fully comprehend it or grasp it. It's something too great for our creaturely minds to take in. If we could make complete sense of it, then we would be God, because only God knows the end from the beginning. Only He is able to oversee and determine all of the events in between the end and the beginning. But we're told that this is God's gift to us, verse 13. So He's created us in His image. He's given us the capacity to have such high and lofty thoughts, but He's also set limits on what we can know, and this enables us to live our lives in the present, to know joy, to do good, to find pleasure in our toil. As Peter puts it in the New Testament, we can entrust ourselves to our faithful Creator, in whose hands the future is secure, and get on with living in the present. Thirdly, joy in God's sovereign salvation. See how God's sovereignty over history isn't the same as philosophy's idea of fate or determinism. The 1689 Baptist Confession puts it this way: God has decreed in Himself from all eternity, by the most wise and holy counsel of His will, freely and unchangeably, all things whatsoever that come to pass. But that's not fate. Because as we see here, His purpose in decreeing all things is to a relational end, that people fear before Him. His work of predestination, as it says in Romans 8:29, is so that we may be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He, the Son, Jesus, may be the firstborn among many brothers, a relational term. So that's what fear before Him means. It means being in a right relationship with Him. But that's not all. What does God do in His sovereignty with those who don't fear before Him? Well, He seeks, is it there? He seeks what has been driven away. To those who are under His judgment, those who've been rightly driven away from His presence because of sin, He acts sovereignly to seek and to save that which is lost. Now that's where your security must lie in your salvation. Not just in the fact that God has done it, but also the reason He's done it is because He planned and determined to do it from before the creation of the world. Fourthly, we can have joy in anticipating the triumph of God's justice. Now, like last time, we've come back to this dilemma of injustice, where the wicked prosper And even the institutions designed for upholding justice are compromised by evil. Now see how he closes this section with the same phrase with which he began. There is a time for every matter. But now we can read it with new eyes. We can see the good, beautiful, sovereign purposes of God and know that even the injustices and corruption of this world are being worked together by God towards the day when his justice will triumph. The reality of the coming day of judgment, that's the only thing that can keep us standing firm through the injustices of life, knowing that in the end, God will punish wickedness and he will vindicate the righteous. Now, the big question that we need to ask after all of that is, well, how does Jesus fit into all of this? Well, he is the one who makes those four conclusions real. Galatians 4:4-5 tells us, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Throughout his ministry, Jesus repeatedly said, my time is not yet come, my time is not yet come. And then eventually he declared, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And he's speaking there of his death on the cross. Jesus' whole life was not randomly worked out as he went, nor was it kind of locked into some fatalistic trajectory. No, Jesus' life was the outworking of his unwavering commitment to do his Father's will. That will that had been established and agreed to in the eternal covenant between the Father and the Son from eternity. So in light of that, let's look one more time at this poem, and we'll see how for every line of the poem, there's a parallel in the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus. Some of them are big and significant, others are just things that he's put into his teaching on the parables that picks up the sentiment of this poem about time from the vertical perspective. Time to be born and a time to die. Well, that's Jesus' entire life, isn't it? Between the miracle of the incarnation by his virgin birth, by which he took on our humanity, all the way to his death on the cross as a sacrifice for sin to reconcile us to God. A time to be born and a time to die, and nothing was out of time in that. Time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. Well, we know, don't we, Jesus told multiple parables about planting and harvesting, depicting the spiritual life that begins through the word of God being planted and then culminates in a life that brings glory to God. A time to kill and a time to heal. Well, Jesus healed countless people as signs of what's to come in the kingdom for those with faith, but he also warned of the coming judgment of the unrepentant. God, he said, is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. A time to heal, but also a time to kill in judgment. And a time to break down and a time to build up. Jesus foretold the day when the city of Jerusalem and its temple would be reduced to ruins. But he also said that he would build a new city, a new temple, which is the church. We are called the temple of God. We are God's building. And it was all on the foundation of when the temple of his body would be destroyed and then raised up after 3 days. time to weep, and a time to laugh. Remember at the beginning of his ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus called people to be glad, to rejoice at the blessings, the beatitudes that were coming in the new covenant. But his ministry concludes as he sits weeping over Jerusalem because of the judgment that was coming upon her for rejecting him. A time to mourn and a time to dance. In Matthew 11, Jesus compared his generation to children without discernment who don't know when they should mourn or when they should dance. They had this song, we sang for you and you didn't dance, and we played a dirge for you and you didn't mourn. He said of his disciples that while the time will come for them to mourn at his death, they would soon rejoice at his resurrection. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Remember when Jesus confronted the men who had gathered stones to stone a woman caught in adultery. And he forced them to scatter them. He forced them to scatter by pointing out their hypocrisy. And he showed that mercy triumphs over judgment. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. In Jesus' parable of the lost son, the father ran and embraced his son, who had not merely been lost, but who had rebelled against him, who had dishonoured his father. But the older brother refused to welcome his sibling, even though he'd done him no wrong. A time to seek and a time to lose. Well, Jesus told us he is the good shepherd. The shepherd who leaves the 99 to go and find the one that's been lost. And he told many parables to illustrate how God seeks that which has been driven away. And a time to keep and a time to cast away. Still with that shepherd imagery, he's the good shepherd. He says, I am the gate for the sheep. I keep them safe by protecting them from the wolves and the thieves. And so the time will come when he will say to the unrepentant, the wolves and the thieves, depart from me, for I never knew you. A time to tear and a time to sow. Remember Jesus' parable of the new patch on old clothes. It illustrates the discarding of the old and the obsolete in the old covenant to make way for the new that's come in him. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. During Jesus' trial, there were times when he spoke to affirm his identity as the Messiah. But there were other times when he remained silent because he refused to defend himself or to retaliate. A time to love and a time to hate. Jesus called his disciples to love one another as he had loved them. But he also warned them that they must be prepared also to, in his words, hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and even his own life in order to be his disciples. He wasn't talking there about an emotional hatred. He was saying being willing to give it up, to lose it completely for the sake of following him. And then finally, a time for war and a time for peace. Jesus ultimately came to bring peace on earth by establishing the kingdom that was announced by the angels at his birth. But he also warned that until that time comes, the result of the gospel being proclaimed in the world will be sword and division and conflict. That was just a little snippet We could look at so much more. In fact, as I was preparing that, I thought I could do a sermon on just each one of these. There's so much in there, not just in the phrase itself, but in how Jesus infuses it with meaning and purpose in his own life and ministry. Only in Jesus can we see how God makes all things beautiful in their time, how all the loose threads of that poem are brought together and they're woven into this tapestry that displays the sovereign goodness and grace and mercy of the Father's plans. So in Christ, as we heard read, we're set free. We're set free from seeing life as a random succession of meaningless events or as mere impersonal fate. Instead, we can see that our God is working all things together for good for those who love him and are called to his purpose, his beautiful purpose. Let's pray.